Hi guys, welcome to Novum. I just got Promising Young Woman, and wow, is this film not messing around. I'm going to go through every major scene and break down what's going on for you guys, because while the subtext is relatively obvious throughout, it's so tightly woven that there's still a great amount that you can miss. This is honestly some of the cleanest dialogue in terms of conveying second meaning I've ever seen put on screen. I won't dwell on it throughout, but Emerald Fennell is rapidly becoming one of my favourite filmmakers and writers. Killing Eve is also phenomenal, and Carey Mulligan, who plays the main character Cassie here, is out of this world. I'm not a big fan of Bo Burnham, but he wasn't bad here. He did what he needed to do, and believably enough. Obviously, I realised that a large portion of this film is poking fun at men and even YouTube videos and mansplaining, and all of that irony isn't lost on me now making a video about it. But it's so good that I've just got to talk about it, and it is fundamentally a protest movie that wants men to pay attention as well as women. And ultimately what the film is protesting, which is very broad and cultural in places but extremely specific in others, it's all pretty essential knowledge for what's happening right now. So I think talking about it, either in the context of how good this movie is, or the problems it's pointing towards, it's very much worth doing. So let's get started, and beware of spoilers right from the get-go. Normally something I'd miss out, but these opening credits do an amazing job at setting the tone for the whole movie. We've got I Was Busy Thinking About Boys by Charli XCX blasting out, and this kicks off a recurring theme of female-driven pop songs being problematized. We've got Thinking About Boys as we're about to meet a main character obsessed with toxic male behavior. We've got an amazing orchestral composition of Toxic by Britney Spears as she goes to confront toxic males. We've got It's Raining Men, as we're supposed to assume that Cassie has just murdered Adam Brody, and it goes on throughout the movie. The soundtrack isn't just fitting, it invites you to fill in a double meaning, and it uses a medium through which women are generally marketed to and divine societal self-image from, which is the female pop song. These songs are huge influencing factors on culture, how women are portrayed, how women, specifically young women and teenage girls, develop ideals of themselves, and it's a really important theme in the movie, and it uses these songs as a tool to make you question these ideals and how society views and portrays women. To kick that off and focus back in on Thinking About Boys, we see a very similar thing in that music video to what we see in the opening of the film. The video flips the tables on men and women in music videos and treats men as women are traditionally treated, with panning sections of body parts and close-ups that are structured to be sexually alluring. This is an inversion of the gaze, which I touched on in my recent Alien video, but is even more relevant here, so let's break it down quickly. The gaze is a centuries-old trope in art, specifically painting and sculpture, and later photography and film. It explores who is being looked at and who is doing the looking, the gazing at the subject. And as you may have guessed, that is traditionally men doing the looking and women being the ones looked at. It goes deeper than that. For example, the gaze of the subject is crucial too. If we have a naked woman looking out at the viewer, making eye contact, this is code for her being promiscuous. She is okay with you looking. If we get a nude woman looking away from the viewer, then we are supposed to presume she is the opposite. She is innocent and either uncomfortable or more often unaware of the viewer. When people talk about the male gaze, they usually mean that men are looking at women, but this becomes even more crucial when men are the subject. Where are they looking? Male underwear modeling in the 90s was just men staring away into middle distance. Most male modeling still is for this reason. It is, or more so was, deemed homosexual for them to be accepting of the viewer's gaze by looking back at the camera. And this changed dramatically when David Beckham did a very famous underwear shoot and stared right at the camera. Since then, we've seen it become a lot more common. Now, for I Was Thinking About Boys and the intro credits in Promising Young Woman, that's pretty much all you need to know. They're inverting this trope and making men the subject of the female gaze. We focus on their dancing, their crotches, and thrusting and grinding, and it's all very reminiscent of club scenes with scantily clad women in movies. However, this is where the two medias deviate, because Promising Young Woman has a lot more to say. And so, while we do see these men arguably being objectified, there's also a silliness to it, a kind of gross quality that isn't present when we see scenes of women dancing. The film is purposefully objectifying men throughout, but it's not quite that simple. It's really more making fun of them. The men shown dancing aren't hunky, they're middle-aged, old, overweight. We're looking at the general fools men make of themselves when trying to put on sexual displays in nightclubs, and for me it's scarily accurate and one of many points I felt personally attacked during this movie. In line with our theory of the gaze, these men are not looking at the camera like we see in the music video. The video has men accepting that they are being looked at sexually by acknowledging the camera. Here the men in the film are naturally unaware of the camera, and so it takes on more of a nature documentary style vibe where we're looking at men in their natural behaviors without them being aware of it. So we've got an inversion going on where it's a woman as the person looking and the men as the subject of the looking, but rather than it being sexual, it's kind of ridiculous because, as this scene points out, men in clubs are usually a bit ridiculous. During these credits, we're Cassie, or any woman sat in the corner of the nightclub thinking, what am I doing here, while feeling a little bit disgusted. As the music fades out, the very first line of the movie is a guy at a bar loudly exclaiming, "Fuck her," as we meet Adam Brody and friends having a generally terrible and dismissive conversation about the concerns of a female colleague not being included in their after-work hangouts. From the moment the credits end, we're really seeing everything from Adam Brody's point of view. We see him not being quite on board with the purposefully chauvinistic discussion his friends are having, and this continues as they notice the supposedly paralytic Cassie sprawled in the booth seat. It's worth noting how many times we see Carey Mulligan essentially or completely alone in frame, just as Cassie is essentially alone in the film. Not just through her lack of connections and social life, but in that she seems to be the only one awake to the problems men are imposing, and we'll look at that in a lot more detail shortly. It's also not the only time we see her in a Christ pose, in clear allusion to the sacrifice Cassie is taking on in trying to stop predatory male behavior. From the guy's very first look at her, we see their conversation take a very predatory turn. Now, it's an important distinction that these men are not men who consider themselves rapists. There isn't one of those in the movie, in fact. But from here, we'll see that even though the film presents it relatively evenly, you will walk away from this feeling like they have crossed several serious boundaries, and that this was leading to a scenario we could have clearly recognized as rape. And this is something you see in most nightclubs. A lot of this behavior we generally accept, and for a film that is extremely concerned with rape, we never see one violent sexual act. That is not normal for portrayals of rape on screen, but it is sadly extremely common in real life. This is stuff that happens in most countries, most modern cultures, and isn't, for the most part, viewed as rape. In the eyes of the law, Cassie goes back to this guy's apartment willingly, despite never really giving verbal consent to do that. And really, just from that act alone, in the eyes of the law, we're already in a grey area, even though we as an audience recognize Cassie as being completely unable to consent. That's what this film is determined to explore, and it's determined to make you recognize it. It's determined to make people at every level of the power structure recognize it. That starts here with this conversation, which is definitely meant to make you feel more than a bit disgusted, as these guys start to talk about her in a way that sounds very predatory, but uses the exact lexicon of victim blaming. They're justifying what they want to do to her as being her fault, and using the language of misguided social concern to get there. Now, when I said the dialogue is flawless throughout, I really meant it. Almost every piece of it has layered meaning. The way the lines are delivered here is predatory, but the language, if seen written, is not just one of supposed concern, but one that is extremely familiar when we discuss these he said, she said rape scenarios. For example, if she's not careful, someone's going to take advantage, describing her as an easy target and saying they put themselves in danger, girls like that. From there, they slide very quickly into fantasizing and discussing how hot she is. Fennel is using the language of rape culture to demonstrate the real sentiment behind it. What these guys are saying could be deemed as actual concern, but it quickly becomes obvious from their delivery that that isn't really the case. They see her as sexual prey and the easy target they were describing. It took their concern mere sentences to slip into predatory attraction. It's almost difficult to put into words how smart this dialogue is, and this will be the case throughout. It's exposing hypocrisy in the things the film protests against while using the very language that ordinarily supports it, and in doing so exposes the true desires and intentions behind it. In this case, that the fake concern of victim blaming is quickly revealed to be a mask for predatory sexuality, and it achieves all of this while keeping a modern, normal sounding flow to it that doesn't take you out of the film in any way. Adam Brody and McLovin both represent a specifically problematic brand of modern masculinity, that being the nice guy, something that's quickly become shorthand for a guy that thinks he's nice but is either predatory or weird or really anything but his self-proclamation of nice guy. This is presumably why they were cast for this, as they're both actors generally deemed unthreatening and trustworthy by audiences. Adam Brody's character seems to be more towards the predatory side of things here. The nice guy acts something he's more interested in putting on for his male friends. He thinks he's above their alpha male chauvinism, but as we quickly see, he's extremely predatory. The film lulls us into believing he's a good guy in mimicry of female experiences with guys they believe to be good. We as the audience quickly lose our innocence to this as we realize he has far more insidious plans, and really he has from the start. Before, when his friends started laughing that he was going to see if she was okay, we were correctly under the assumption that Adam Brody is a nice guy and that his friends were the sexist assholes. But as soon as we realize Brody's intentions, this becomes a lot more troubling. They were making a joke, sure, but they also probably know what this guy is like. I mean, we find out later in the film that he absolutely discussed the events with them, so it's not something he was really trying to hide. It's the first of many subversions, and it's absolutely drawing attention to the dangers of guys that affect being nice to try and prey on lone, drunk, or vulnerable women, like the one Cass is pretending to be. And other guys are shown to enable it. The Uber driver doesn't care at all that he's pressuring her into going back to his place, telling him to just put whatever address in the app. His friends are certainly encouraging with him approaching her, treating it as an aspect of masculine competition, a challenge, as they describe it. They leave the bar, and it quickly becomes obvious that Adam Brody is a man with a plan. One beer back at his place becomes kumquat liqueur. He lies to her and manipulates her consistently, even apologizing for his friends even though she had no interactions with them. He's banking on her being out of it and unable to remember what's just happened. From the different sized drinks to the don't go to sleep, we're very quickly realizing just what sort of guy we're dealing with, while not yet crossing any legal boundary but still being entirely morally absent. It twists your stomach because you know you're watching a situation where it's absolutely a rape, but probably one you wouldn't be able to prove due to the run-up to it. I honestly felt scared and disgusted, and that leads into this really exhilarating opener where we, again, seeing from Adam Brody's point of view, are treated to this oh shit moment where Cassie is completely sober and confrontational. It's awesome, and with this hard cutaway, you're absolutely supposed to think you're now watching a movie about a female killer that preys on predatory men. It's an inverting, destabilizing act for the men watching. That's why you were seeing it from Adam Brody's point of view rather than Cassie's. It wants the men in the audience to question their behavior, to feel slightly castrated and concerned. It wants women to feel suddenly empowered. That's why when we cut back to Cassie following the incident, her arm is covered in what may be blood but what's actually ketchup as she bites into the phallic hot dog. And we've got It's Raining Men playing to make this insinuation that male bodies are falling because she's out to kill them. Now we know that's not what's happening, but it's what the movie wants you to think at this point. It's actually what it's working towards eventually, but it keeps itself more grounded in reality than this intro suggests. The point is the same though. She's here to take away male power, and because this film doesn't stop for a second, that's exactly what happens next as she runs into a group of construction workers. This is of course an extremely common but everyday meme of sexual harassment, the catcalling construction worker. They start making lewd comments towards her about being on a walk of shame, asking her how much, miming erections at her, and so on. She doesn't say anything but simply starts staring back at them. She starts objectifying them back. She inverts the gaze, as we discussed with the intro credits. And what happens? Well, it turns out they don't like being stared at either. It generates fear and confusion in them. Some slight anger through their confusion, but ultimately it's a fear response. They don't know what to do. We see this fear and confusion in every single man Cassie confronts throughout the movie. They are castrated, confused, and ultimately terrified by female power wielded in their direction. As a male viewer, that's really how the film wants you to feel, and ultimately this leads to the exact same thing it wants women to feel: questioning of existent sexual and power dynamics between genders. There are some very blatant and specific gaps in our cultural morality that this film is pointing to. Men approaching seriously inebriated women at bars, men shouting supposedly complimentary but actually horrifying things at women in the street, and as we'll see, horrendous problems with sexual assault, not limited to but particularly on college campuses. These are all things that predominantly go unpunished or even uncondemned in most cases, and it's something the film is ultimately concerned with, as we'll see. It wants to demonstrate how this problem is endemic, and how the acceptance of small actions like catcalling leads to the grim reality of sexual violence we see explored further on in the movie. From castrated construction workers, we move to Cassie's version of a little black book. It's a subversion, as with everything else she does, and rather than keeping a list of guys' phone numbers, she instead keeps a revenge journal, tallying off a new mark of revenge for each encounter. But revenge isn't exactly accurate, and these tally marks become an important and recurring theme in the movie. I'll explain more as we go through, but while Cassie's goal is ultimately revenge-driven, the goal itself is accountability. It happened off screen, but Adam Brody has been held accountable for his actions by Cassie, and that's what she's really ticking off. That's what her revenge plot is all about, holding anyone and everyone that participated accountable. And by the looks of her journal, she's been doing this a lot. The music here definitely wants you to think these are all people Cassie has murdered, but as we know, this isn't the case. This is a repeating pattern of subversion designed to make you question how you're viewing this woman based on your own preconceptions that the film proves to be wrong. It makes you think one thing without ever telling you that's the case, and then moves the goalposts. And it's not just done to force you to reconsider your judgments of people and demonstrate how first impressions are misleading. It's also a really smart storytelling device that creates a lot of mystery while still providing a satisfying and cohesive narrative. Next up, we get a glimpse at Cassie's home life and her parents. There's a focus put on the pointlessness and banality of modern interactions throughout the film, and this is really evident with the film's only exploration of married life with Clancy Brown and Jennifer Coolidge. And this is really clever casting of those two actors because they're both larger-than-life personalities that we see completely dulled and sterilized here. It's off-putting how downtrodden they are, but they both give tremendous performances nonetheless. In this first scene with them, the focus is mainly on Cassie's complete disinterest in having any kind of meaningful interaction with them. We see this just after in her conversation with Gale as well. She just says whatever she needs to placate them, to be left alone. We'll look in more detail as we go through, but I think the ultimate answer here is that she views these interactions to be fruitless because she doesn't see other people as being awake to or aware of the problems that she sees. She doesn't want to stop. Just like Batman, she's aware of the detriment her mission is causing in her life, and she doesn't care because she sees the mission as more valuable. She knows if she's honest about it, people will try to rationalize, tell her to move on, either ignore the problems as her mother does, or desire to move past them like Nina's mother does. But Cassie can't ignore them. She can't move past them, and so she gives this part of her life up. And we see that in both of these scenes as she blindly lies to people around her so that she can be left alone to her battle. To stick with the coffee shop a moment longer, it's given a deliberately demanding title in Make Me Coffee, and we see Cassie has no interest in doing that when she dismisses the vapid teenager that comes to the counter. Just like the older generation shown by Cassie's mother is demonstrated to not be awake to her problems, the youth is also shown to be uncaring of what awaits them, and Cassie has no time for them either. Gale demonstrates the same kind of language that almost every man in the film does. It's demands and insults and commands, even though they're worded in a kind and caring way. When you break down the language of what's being said, it's never actually quite that. We'll see this done really stealthily with Bo Burnham's character throughout the film. Again, super important to look at what they're saying rather than how they're saying it. Now with Gale, we can safely presume she has Cassie's best interests at heart, but that's not really what's crucial here. What's crucial is the film, literally line by line, presenting modern constructions of language and demonstrating how they're used to control and manage female behavior. Gale isn't an antagonist. It's just that the problem is so widespread that it's inescapable. It's ubiquitous to how we speak to each other. Another tally in the Revenge Journal, and in the original screenplay this was actually a mark for a guy in the coffee shop who was rude to the girl who asked for coffee. Cassie purposefully spilled scalding coffee in his lap, and that would have been the next tally. That would have been a fun scene, but ultimately I think they were right to change it because it would have given the game away too early that Cassie's not actually killing these guys. We cut back from the tallying to Cassie at the coffee shop again, providing this sharp and brief demonstration of what her life is, which is to say a permanent cycle of work and revenge. We see Cassie reading a book here called Careful How You Go. This was the title for Emerald Fennell's short film that semi-inspired, or rather was the precursor to this movie, and again focused on a very realist kind of female villain. Here we see Cassie perhaps taking inspiration from that. And then we meet Ryan, and this is someone the film sort of wants us to like, sort of being crucial here because the film has been forcing us to view men in a very definite way up until this point, the way Cassie sees men. With Ryan, Cassie sees a hope for future happiness and a hope that he's different. So for now, she's blind to it. She's a little standoffish with him at first, but ultimately she's drawn in. That doesn't mean we as the audience are though, and if you've been paying attention, you should already be noticing things that don't quite sit right. His initial blunder with asking about her job, the thought that he could just go away and come back and try again, the fact that with no real rapport beyond insulting her, he asks her out. It's all presented in a way where it could be seen as charming and anxious, but when you break it down, it all fundamentally requires him to not care about her agency, to not see her as an individual beyond what he can get from her sexually. And it's adding to this consistency of language being littered with microaggressions against women. That does not mean against women from men necessarily, simply against women. As we'll see throughout, this is not just a problem permeated by men, but it is always something targeted at women. From here we move quickly to writer, director, producer, attack helicopter Emerald Fennell, with a cameo in a YouTube makeup tutorial that Cassie is watching. Specifically a tutorial for blowjob lips, which is just another example of the kind of imaging that young women are being bombarded with, and the undercurrent that how you look is directly linked to your sexual self-worth. That rather than the importance of self-image, the image presented to the opposite sex, to men, is the one to be concerned with. We see this in the suggested videos, such as dramatic cat eye to make him quiver. It's lampooning how female-driven media is all devoted to making a positive sexual impression on men. It's also lampooning the whole YouTube, Instagram influencer space with the don't forget to like and subscribe. We are supposed to assume that this woman is in no way considering the social impact she's having in circulating these videos, in who she's influencing, or whether or not her impact is positive for young women. She cares about her subscribers and her own popularity. As we see with other female characters, she is vapid. She doesn't question the importance of male attention, she just wants to tell you how to get more of it. And again, Cassie is subverting this. She's studying the same tutorial, but for her it's camouflage. It's a tool for the hunt. And at this point, we're still supposed to be thinking she's killing these guys, so again, there's this destabilizing, castrating quality to her inverting sexual attraction and using it as a way to find her own kind of male victim. And to put But the icing on that cake, and one of my favourite shots of the film, we see her smudge the perfectly tutorialed blowjob lips into a Joker-esque drunken smear. And I'm not saying that this movie is Joker but for women, I'm not saying that, but I definitely think there's something purposeful to the lipstick being smudged in front of the vanity mirror. I think it's fair to say the movies have similarities, so too with Taxi Driver, of characters becoming aware of everyone being awful and becoming these lone agents of chaos in vain and misguided efforts to seek justice. But I think it's actually not fair to compare this film to Joker or Taxi Driver, even though both of those films are phenomenal. The difference for me is that with both of them, there isn't really a target for all the rage. Joker has mean people on public transport, you could argue it's against the rich with the stockbrokers and Thomas Wayne and so on, and in Taxi Driver it's directed at the criminal underbelly of New York. Really, in both of these films, everyone seems to be terrible, and there isn't as much emphasis put on the target as there is the escalation of the main character's reaction. Promising Young Woman protests broad stuff just the same. Cultural things like we've covered so far, use of language, societal norms, policing of female behaviour, and so on. But from here on, it's going to start getting a lot more specific as it narrows its lens of revenge and accountability. It's not just going to focus in on rape, but rape on college campuses, but also even specific cases, high-profile cases of that happening in real life. And to me, that really distinguishes this film in a way the others didn't manage to. I'm not saying this is a better film than Taxi Driver, or Joker for that matter, but in this one respect, I think Emerald Fennell has really broken new ground. For me, it's the differentiation between this being a simple revenge movie and it being a protest movie. Fennell knows where to target her main character's rage, which institutions and power structures allowed for these problems to occur in real life, and she attacks them through the movie. It adds a lot of weight and realism to Cassie's struggle for accountability, and just makes it all the more heartbreaking in its conclusion. Next up, we have McLovin and his mound of coke, and even more so than with Adam Brody, we see the nice guy trope and the reality that he's anything but. He's self-obsessed and mansplaining between bumps, not understanding the literature he's discussing, unable to finish his novel because he's too much of a perfectionist, his novel that is concerned with what it's like to be a guy in this world. He's essentially new wave chauvinism or fake woke, fake feminist, really just a mountain of annoying, however you want to describe it. Again, we see everything phrased like command, like seriously you got to read it, or veiled criticism designed to self-aggrandize, like why do women wear so much makeup, I think you guys are so much more beautiful without it. So with the guys at the bar, we saw this language of victim blaming being matched with this kind of predatory reality behind it. We see a similar thing here where he's using this fake woke pseudo-academic language, and it's been matched with what is essentially pickup artist behavior like negging. Just as with the scene at the bar, we see Fennell make a pretty clear distinction as to the kind of behavior this language is associated with and protecting. He may be trying to say the right things, but the underlying intention is predatory. The guys at the bar use fake concern, McLovin uses fake concern, and both are using it as a route to convince women to sleep with them, and all of that is achieved using language that we consider to be everyday. I'm sure we've all said, oh, you've got to read that book, or some of these lines at some point in our lives. It's never pushed to an extreme, and that's what makes it so sharp. It's not pointing to extremes, it's pointing to how intrinsic this stuff is to our language, and in doing so it forces us to address it. Beyond the actual words he's saying, his behavior is undoubtedly predatory. He puts some coke on her gums without her permission, which is most definitely an unwanted metaphorical penetration, a real one too, in a sense. He pushes her and jabs her awake when she fakes passing out. The whispering of good girl as she drinks the water, the implication being she's a good girl for trying to sober up enough to fuck. The more problematic connotation being we did not see him pour this drink, and he seems very eager to have her drink it. The film has got you thinking as a victim in these scenarios because that's all it's been concerned with. You're meant to be worrying, as Cass would have to, why he's so eager to see her drink that. And from there, we see this progress from really troubling to definitely sexually assault as she repeats, I need to go, and he attempts digital intercourse. And then, just like with Adam Brody, we see this destabilizing moment where she reveals her sobriety and confronts him directly. And just as with every male character in the film, we see primarily a reaction of fear. Suddenly he wants her to leave after insisting that she stay. And what the film makes obvious but doesn't say explicitly is that the difference is agency. All that changes is that she is revealed to be of a sober mind and in control of her own actions. Neil continues to panic and repeat, I'm a nice guy, which in any other film would be a subtle nod to what we've been discussing, but here it actually feels a little on the nose given how tightly woven everything else is. Cassie once again inverts the gender dynamic and starts talking to him in language traditionally used towards women, like, you really need to calm down. Cassie points out that nice guys aren't as rare as Neil thinks, and that men never want to fuck her once she's exposed herself as sober and in control. The subtext is extremely clear. Men are afraid of female agency, of women who can and will say no. It's the same thing we saw in Adam Brody's character in The Construction Workers. It actually becomes more cartoonish throughout in the run-up to the finale for this very reason. It's trying to paint men as scared little boys in the face of assertive female power. This may seem obvious, but it's worth pointing out because it's one of the places the film purposefully deviates from realism to make a point. The implication isn't that men will run away screaming when women say no. It's a larger point about male reactions to female power, demonstrated through caricatures of failed masculinity. Before we go any further, we need to look at the title Promising Young Woman. First and foremost, this is an example of microaggressions in our language that the film is very keen to point out. The connotation being that when the phrase promising young woman comes up, it's either in the context of a woman being murdered or turning up missing or some other tragedy, and also as a condemnation of a woman doing something out of the ordinary, like, oh, it's such a shame she didn't finish university, she was such a promising young woman, and so on. It can be used broadly to try and force female compliance to societal expectation, like, oh, you must go to Harvard, you're such a promising young woman. The point is, it's almost never good, whether it's platitudes after tragedy, or a backhanded attempt at control or condemnation. It demonstrates how language is used to measure and control behavior on a societal scale. Fennell has denied the exact reference, but renowned scumbag Brock Turner was described as a promising young man during the Stanford rape case, and this film is at least by proxy referential of that case. Secondly, the title is descriptive of Cassie herself and Nina, and all the other women who have suffered tragedies similar to the one explored here, that these promising young women have had their lives ruined by sexually predatory men. Not just directly, as we see with Nina, but with Cassie too, who was more indirectly affected by the event, but is still unable to move past it and have a life of her own. And finally, there is the more subversive connotation of being a promising young woman. That is to say, what Cassie is doing by putting men in these situations, they see her as making promises to them, that she is at their apartment so she owes them sex. She's promised herself simply by being there. The promising young woman in this case becomes the stalking figure of the night that Cassie is aiming to be, the one we see men terrified of by the end of the film. And so just like a story, you can view it as tragedy or view it as victory. By the end, she becomes another victim of male violence, but also a symbol for male fear that prevents that violence. It's a double-edged sword that uses the everyday connotations of promising young woman to get its point across. Just like with Adam Brody, just like with McLovin, double-edged swords that expose hypocrisy and use everyday constructions of language to do so. Whether or not you even agree with what's being discussed, I think writing like that deserves serious merit. Back to the coffee shop, and we see the return of Ryan, who has come back despite being fake numbered. Again, this is played positively. He's breaking down Cassie's defenses and making an effort and so on. But I doubt at this point anyone is really thinking that. She gave him a clear signal she wasn't interested with the fake number, and he came back to her place of work to force another interaction. We see him do this later on too, when she misses their date and he comes to her house. It's not insane stalker behavior, but it's subtle clues that Ryan is just like the other men in the film and finds it difficult taking no for an answer. He even hints at a safe word during this conversation, which again can be seen as some playful flirtation, but bears some pretty terrifying significance given the broader events of the movie. We're treated to a very minor scene with Cassie's parents as she gets ready to go on a date, but I think it's probably the most crucial scene for understanding their role in the movie and in Fennell's commentary. We're treated to a full-screen clip from Night of the Hunter, in which Robert Mitchum plays a crazed preacher hunting loot from a bank robbery and tormenting the children of the late bank robber. This guy is not a fan of women. In fact, he is a deranged serial killer that marries women and then kills them and dumps their bodies in rivers. In this case, a specifically blonde woman. The clip we're shown has the preacher lamenting women and suggesting God is angry at them for their behavior. Now, this has clear relevance to what's going on in Promising Young Woman. It's another example of women being portrayed negatively and violently in media, and its age demonstrates that this is a long-standing issue. But obviously, it's fiction in fiction here, so what's more telling to us in our narrative is how these characters respond to it. Cassie's dad is asleep, tuned out to it, and therefore emotionally unaware of this sort of world of hatred and negativity towards women. Cassie's mother is quietly awake, aware, but with seemingly zero emotional response. No kind of protest. She is absorbing, internalizing, and unwittingly participating in this diminishment and control of women that Cassie is hyper-aware of. The subtext is clear. Young women are waking up to what previous generations quietly accepted as normal. This is a fight for the young people. The older generation are tuned out to it. They already fought their fight, and this is the next evolution of that, with contemporary problems, higher standards, and a finer lens. Following this scene, we get a lot of development between Cassie and Ryan. We see their date go well, although there are still plenty of red flags that Ryan isn't someone the film wants us to trust. He doesn't understand why she wouldn't finish med school, refusing to accept the answer that she wanted to do something else. As I mentioned, here she's the promising young woman that didn't finish med school. Her primary wants and motivations are considered secondary to social expectations of success. A larger cause for concern comes from their walk home, where Bo Burnham surprises her with the fact that they're outside his apartment and proceeds to invite her up. Now this clearly makes Cassie uncomfortable, but this could be considered as quite a normal progression of things at this point. There is a brief sense of, oh no, Ryan is like every other guy here, but Cassie's discomfort predominantly comes from her repeated negative interactions with the men in her revenge journal and her general anxieties over male sexual violence. The going up to his apartment here is a trigger because that's where she's carrying out her revenge plots, in various men's apartments, and this reminds her of her own inability to trust and the motivations behind that. But while Cassie is trying to figure out the commitment issues, she's still blind to all of Ryan's red flags. He has led her here surreptitiously. He has manipulated her and been less than truthful, even if it was just in a playful way. And while a normal rom-com might play this move off as something cute, that's what this film is trying to expose. His behavior isn't okay, even if we and Cassie would traditionally recognize it as acceptable. Just like with the "do you mind if I come back and do this thing over" from the coffee shop, it's cliche behavior that's been romanticized, but ultimately puts the woman involved in a precarious or diminished place. After a quick bit of soul searching, Cassie decides to go and patch things up with Ryan. The scene has the perfect demonstration of this layered double meaning that's ever present in the script. We get a touching interaction between Cassie and Ryan, but the film doesn't want us to be tricked like Cassie is here. We're thinking in a victim-predator binary because of exactly how the film is laid out. And so when Ryan cutely says to her, "don't move," and mimes a forceful hand gesture of keeping someone in place, we know what the real signal is. Things are not okay, and this guy is not to be trusted. Just like his mention of the safe word, this too is some pretty brutal foreshadowing for the end of the movie. Even if Ryan didn't turn out to be an antagonist, this would still be in line with the film's demonstration of how everyday language is used to police female behavior, and how cliches of romantic comedies actually hide some problematic messages for sexual interaction, like showing up with placards so your friend can't hear you expressing your love to his wife. Just like with the pop songs and makeup tutorials, we see a medium in romantic comedies that women derive self-image from being held up to harsh scrutiny here. There's a good 15 to 20 minutes in the middle of this film that feels like a romantic comedy, but we are very much not supposed to watch it as one. We watch it with the close and troubled lens the film forced on us in the opening act. Just like Cassie, we're unable to enjoy the love story because we're reminded of the horrible events that have come before. I want to draw your attention to the moments following Gail's departure from the coffee shop, once Cassie and Ryan are alone. Almost immediately, he asks her if she keeps in contact with anyone from their college, and the moment he does, we get this intense, slow creeping zoom to everything to simulate her anxiety and tension just at the mention of this place. It's extremely effective at creating a sudden claustrophobia and a sense of Cassie's PTSD. We see this matched with a menacing tone and move to double speed at the mention of the name Al Monroe. Now this is really clever, but it's also really essential because we don't see Al Monroe on screen until the final scenes of the film. So there had to be a way to add dramatic impact to his introduction when that introduction is simply a name. And this really works. You feel the weight of it, and you're ignorant of the fact the film's already been building to it calmly for a minute when it drops. As Ryan continues to discuss Al Monroe's happy life, we see the camera draw into extreme close-up on Cassie, who is trying not to look shaken by the news. And it's here that we see the main conflict of the film kick off. Cassie sits awake in the dark, unable to process the absence of justice and accountability in Al Monroe's life. After some social media stalking, she hatches a plan, one that begins with meeting Alison Brie's character Madison for lunch. And as we cut there, we get a pink numeral indicating 1. As we know, this is in visual reference to her revenge tally in her little black book. This demonstrates to the audience that this is a first step in an entirely new and more meaningful brand of revenge. I think it's shown as a Roman numeral, again as a subversion. A single line on screen wouldn't have the same visual impact, but it would also give the game away that this is a revenge of 5 parts, given that the 5th and final part comes as a twist ending. We'll see this tally theme be played with in some subtle ways throughout, and I'll point them out as we move through. The camera stays focused at table height here, even when Cassie, Madison, and the waiter are out of frame. This works in a number of ways. We get a quick demonstration of fake closeness between the women. We ignore the male help entirely, save for keeping their crotch in view, kind of similar to how you may just see cocktail dresses in the background as Bond plays cards against a villain. But most importantly, it keeps focus on Cassie's plan, the encounter at the table that she has set up so meticulously that she leans back and smiles at it for a moment. She's in full control here, and the camera maintains a similar kind of control over the scene. scene. When Cassie gets up to greet Madison, the camera stays right where it is, and we know from that some serious shit is about to go down at this table. Now, this scene is really important in demonstrating a whole other side of the coin in terms of what we've been discussing so far. While there have been minor clues that women aren't exempt from the film's scrutiny, it really comes into clear focus here that women are being held responsible for the diminishment of women as well. Just like with Cassie's mother, Madison is at first only interested in playing into gendered stereotypes, affecting the societal expectations of the perfect wife in order to find a husband and derive self-worth and societal status from that. But more than that, we see that she's actively been a part of the process of sexual violence against women. She may not have carried out the act, but she didn't speak up, she didn't listen, and she didn't condemn the perpetrators who she remains friends with. As we'll see, this is something both Cassie and the film see as an extremely important cog to the free perpetration of rape culture, and one they intend to hold accountable. And just like we see the sexual violence as being the end result of this society that accepts catcalling and victim blaming, we see these negative female behaviors take their root in social exchanges exactly like this one. A practiced dishonesty in favor of social acceptance, let's say. Just like we see Madison admit to once she's had a few drinks. She isn't being honest about herself, she isn't being honest to her husband, she certainly isn't speaking her mind to Cassie, nor is she telling the truth about what happened to Nina. And her dishonesty, out of desire to be liked or desire not to rock the boat, it's integral in keeping what happened to Nina under wraps. I know it can be very easy to look at this film and see it as something that hates men, and I'll admit it certainly isn't nice to them. But this is in no way skewed towards attacking one gender, it's attacking a problem. And unfortunately for everyone, that problem is culture-wide. It takes ingrained behavior and social etiquette and all manner of extraneous bullshit to allow things like sexual violence to go unpunished, and this film wants to attack them all. And now, yes, the perpetrators of sexual violence may be in a vast majority male and ultimately responsible for their action, but this film isn't just going after the direct perpetrators. It goes after everyone it feels is accountable, every step of the power structure from bottom to top, and then to the perpetrator himself. And for Fennel, it seems that as far as women are concerned, that negativity starts between them in how they communicate with one another and how they market ideals of what womanhood should be. We see that here in Madison suggesting that wives shouldn't actually work and taking a not so subtle dig at feminists preferring anal. It's clear she doesn't like other women beyond them seeing her as socially above them. And it's clear that Cassie has no time for her. She isn't just ignorant of the problems Cassie is attacking, she's part of them. Madison also claims that all guys want the same thing, a good girl, which is reminiscent of the quote, all men want a strong woman until they meet one, which is exactly what we see happen when Cassie confronts her would-be suitors with her sober confidence. The film seems to be pretty certain of the ideal that men have in mind for their wives, and it's one of quiet passivity, the good girl Madison now lives the part of. Eventually, Cassie brings up her real reason for contacting Madison, and as soon as she does, we get the same intense crawling zoom we saw in the coffee shop, and you'll see this used throughout to quickly reactivate this feeling of dread whenever the plot moves to the events between Nina and Al. As soon as the conversation changes track, we see Madison become uncomfortable, and again we see her using the language of victim blaming to justify her actions. She cites a reputation for sleeping around and calls it a matter of belief, when, as we see, this was something to which there was many witnesses and she had seen evidence of. She even describes Nina's behavior as crying wolf, which has had long-standing associations with victim blaming, and blames her for getting too drunk, which again places deliberate responsibility on victim over perpetrator. The criticism is clear. Horrendous acts are going unpunished because rather than standing up for victims, we have a social tendency to blame them in part for what happened. Now, for Madison, that's out of not wanting to rock the boat socially, but I think on a larger scale, there's a part of us that doesn't want to accept that these things do happen and could happen to us. Our brains reject the idea, like when we try to consider the reality of death, and we accept any alternate story that includes confusion or bias in some way so that we don't have to accept the cruel reality of it. This is a driving force behind conspiracy theories following traumatic events. We begin to resort to fantasy because the brutal reality can be overwhelming. And that's also in the end what we see with Madison. Once Cassie has forced trauma on her, suddenly she does remember the reality of it, and she can no longer stand to see it unpunished. With that in mind, maybe her standoffishness here is in part because she is struggling to accept what she was party to, and finds it easier to recontextualize it as something less predatory. She purposefully uses the term them having sex rather than rape, and it's easy to see how at this point she may have tricked herself into thinking it was. In fact, she says, when you have sex with someone you don't want to, which is essentially the definition of rape and demonstrates the kind of mental gymnastics she's employing rather than calling out the behavior. There are two major subversions happening in this scene upon first viewing. Primarily, we're supposed to get the feeling it was maybe Cassie that was raped rather than Nina. Their conversation is deliberately non-specific, and other than the picture frame with Cassie and Nina on it, there hasn't been any direct mention of Nina thus far. Further to that, we're certainly supposed to believe that Cassie has followed through on paying this man to enact a rape or questionable seduction rather than faking one, as we find out later. And as I mentioned, the film is doing this to encourage you to question your preconceptions of this character and subsequently women on screen. But it also provides a real danger to Cassie. While we may not be thinking she's a killer at this point, or whether we are, we know she's dangerous, motivated, and more than capable of executing this plan. Cassie's ultimate goal is accountability, and Madison's refusal to accept any kind of accountability here is what leads to Cassie going through with the plan. The guy she's hired to do that is another nod to the rapiness of the PUA or pickup artist community, and in fact may have been hired because of his visual resemblance to a certain member of that community known for being a total dickhouse. Now, I'm not sure about this one. I think it's probably a lot more accurate to describe him as just looking like one of those guys, but the resemblance is there, and as we'll see at the end, this is almost certainly something the film is doing with Al Monroe and notorious and convicted college campus rapist Brock Turner, so there is a precedent for it in this movie. And let's stick with college campuses because the second tally of revenge comes next, with Cassie gearing up to abduct the dean's daughter. Firstly, Cassie outside the school like a sex pest chewing a red vine, waiting to pick up a teenage girl is arguably pretty funny. It kind of stops being that as soon as the doors lock and we really realize we have no idea where Cassie's line is. Second, look at how she lures this kid into wanting to take a drive with her. She uses a boy band this girl likes, which pretty much confirms our working theory that this film is critical of how and what pop music is marketed to young girls and how it may be an influencing factor on them making negative decisions. This is also pretty evident from the band being called Wet Dreams, in clear allusion to teenage or developing sexuality, and more importantly, how that is then used to market towards young women. Pretty much the Jonas Brothers on South Park. On to the meeting with the Dean of Forest University. Cassie sits staring at the cover of the prospectus, being taunted by the tagline, "Where all your beginnings begin." This, for her, is a stark reminder that college represented only an end for both her and Nina. The same can be said for the poster on the wall, proudly displaying that your future starts here. And here, for the first time, the film lays out clearly what happened to set Cassie on this path. Nina was raped by Al Monroe, and it went unpunished by the campus and the legal system, and at some point after that, Nina committed suicide. The dean does not remember Nina, not even when Cassie gives her the context of something bad happening to her and the dean dealing with it directly. She most certainly does remember Al Monroe, however, and this drives home the idea of life being for the living, of things moving on unjustly, of everything going unpunished and the perpetrator living guiltlessly despite the victim's suffering. As I've mentioned, this has deliberate parallels with notorious recent cases of rape on college campuses, such as the Brock Turner case, but it's also speaking to the problem as a whole. Rape on college campuses in America and many other countries is an extreme problem. A recent study of 33 American campuses found that just over 1 in 4 women had experienced sexual assault while being attending students. That's a pretty terrifying number, and that's ignorant of the large amount of cases going unreported or unpursued. And so what we get in this scene, more so than any other in the movie, is really an argument between those rallying against this sexual violence and the academic institutions that are on the front line of dealing with these situations, often doing their best to downplay accusations, played out on screen through Cassie and the dean. We see the public debate around these issues play out in microcosm here, and we see them reach a dissatisfying conclusion. This is why we get quite a practical back and forth of the situation at first that leads into the higher philosophical debate. Before we go through that, it's important to remember that we have no doubt over what happened to Nina, of the veracity of the claims being made here. The film has gone out of its way to demonstrate predatory male behavior and the weight of the loss of Nina on Cassie. While the dean may infer an element of he said, she said, we know what the reality is. And so it's extremely damning when this debate kicks off with the dean saying, "We get accusations like this all the time, 1 or 2 a week. It's a widespread issue, just like in real life." And and what remains an accusation for the dean is something that is proven to us to be true, and that has horrendous implications for such widespread and frequent accusations such as the ones the dean admits to. It's also troubling that the dean, and subsequently for the academic institutions she represents, the high frequency of these accusations is a reason in itself not to pursue them, that the problem is so extreme that they wouldn't have the resources, with the quiet implication being that while something remains only an accusation, then there is no reason to take any action at all. It's a terrifying condemnation of sexual safety on college campuses, and one that is very much needed. From there, we see the conversation turn to victim blaming, criticizing Nina again for being drunk and suggesting she may have encouraged the behavior. This is exactly reminiscent of college responses to similar incidents in real life, while also being indicative of social responses as a whole to cases like these. Inevitably, if a girl is assaulted at a frat party, the questions become of her sobriety, of her judgment, and not that of the perpetrator. The dean isn't just some ruthless antagonist here, and she does make some unfortunately salient points. She says very rightly that she can't ruin a young man's life over an accusation. Now, yes, false accusations occur, and if we were to blindly pursue everything, they would certainly occur more frequently. But this film is not about that. It's about the majority of cases that really do happen. This is Cassie and Nina's movie, and so we know that in this instance, not wanting to ruin a young man's life has ruined the lives of two promising young women. And again, there's this connotation of how Brock Turner was described as a promising young man during the trial, not wanting to ruin a young man's life. It seems referential to it, even if Fennell says it isn't. And young man is chosen deliberately here to better mirror that. This is designed to make you address that moral conundrum internally. Because while we know the importance of clear and unbiased justice, we can also see that Nina didn't receive that, and that by implication, many of these other accusations also didn't. And because we're following the track of this social debate, that's where their conversation turns next, with the dean citing innocent until proven guilty. And this is where we see Cassie and the film take a quiet resignation that you can't argue with that. Cassie understands the principle of it, but she also understands the reality behind it. Almost all sexual encounters, desired or otherwise, boil down to she said, he said, because it's two people in private. While she may understand the bedrock need for innocent until proven guilty, she also understands that it had no bearing on Nina's situation other than for allowing her attacker to walk free. And no matter what Cassie attempts to say, whatever discussion she may try to have, the dean will stay within the boundaries of legal practices and social etiquette and do everything she can to stay neutral and avoid accountability in mimicry of these institutions' behavior in real life. And this really is the pivotal point in the film on which everything balances. It's here we find out exactly what happened to Nina, and so it's right here that we have this sort of higher discussion between the film and the institutions the film is criticizing, and we come to understand why Cassie is beyond seeking traditional justice, how these institutions have failed her. We hear the side of the institutions, we hear Cassie's, and with a frustrated resignation, we accept that justice doesn't exist here. We see clearly what Cassie already knew, that she can't get justice legally, so she has to go exact her own kind of revenge. It shows us that here so that we're on board with her downward slope of increasingly extreme revenge. However, Cassie is out for accountability beyond anything else, and so we'll see that when the social discourse and all the moralizing goes out the window, she takes a different tack. As she did with Madison, she forces the dean to be confronted with the same horror that she was by letting her know that she's left her daughter with a bunch of drunk frat boys, and in that desperation and honesty, once she stopped being the dean and is thinking as a mother, she admits, society admits to Cassie, to the film, that it's right. It repeats and repeats it off camera while a smirking Cassie is central in frame. Because when you break it down, you know from the situations you've seen up until this point that she is right. No one would want this for themselves or their daughter or their sister, but the conversation is always one of uncertainty when it's someone you don't know, someone drunk or simply at a party that men are also attending. It shows how useless innocent until proven guilty feels when it's your loved ones that are made victims. The boys in that room were innocent. All the dean was told was that there was a group of boys and alcohol, and she became fearful of a gang rape scenario. She didn't need evidence or a trial. She had a lifelong experience of men and knowledge of what goes on her campus. And now Cassie has forced her to give voice to that, forced her to show her failings in how she treated those that came forward to her in a position of power. It's a damning condemnation of the institutions that allow this behavior a place to propagate. While the film is resigned to the legal and institutional failings around these situations, it is at least hopeful that people know these things to be wrong on a personal level. The dean does break down and recognize Cassie as being right once it is made personal to her. And so what the film is trying to do in light of this is personalize these stories to the audience, to make these social issues personal issues by telling you this hopeless story of loss and revenge, so that next time one of these stories occurs, you think about Nina and Cassie and remember that in the majority of cases, these accusations are very real and horrendously traumatic for the victims. Just as with not actually having Madison sexually assaulted, Cassie doesn't actually leave the dean's daughter in a frat house gang rape scenario. The dean's admittal is certainly her accepting accountability for her absence of care, and so Cassie lets her know that her daughter is unharmed. This is an extremely important distinction on both counts, because if she had actually committed either of these acts, then she would have also been part of this grand cycle of violence against women. It would have been an entirely different film. I don't think she has any interest in that at all things considered, but she certainly does harbour violent intent against two specific men, Al Monroe and his lawyer, and that does imply a cyclical nature to this violence, wherein one violent act in the original rape is the cause of another violent act in Nina's suicide, and that becomes the cause of Cassie's violent attempts at revenge, and then Cassie's eventual violent murder. While it may seem quite positive about violence towards Madison or the dean or the lawyer or Al Monroe, the overall depiction of violence in the film is chilling and hopeless. It's not like I Spit on Your Grave or Straw Dogs, where this revenge violence is supposed to be tantalizing. It portrays a horrific and unsuccessful reality of sad and hopeless acts that take an enormous toll on those that suffer from them. Cassie is entirely aware of that and carries on with her plan anyway, which should let you know how the film ultimately feels about resolving this cycle of violence. Now, sticking with violence, we see Cassie's anger reach a boiling point moment upon leaving the meeting. Once again, she is a victim of male aggression in the street, and once again she has no intention of standing for it. Even though he's being extremely aggressive to her, he immediately becomes confused when she responds in kind. Suddenly she's a crazy bitch in his eyes. This is again common misogynistic language, tying her gender and mental state together and using it to criticize her for essentially not putting up with his abuse. That being said, we do start to see her getting more violent, and she does escalate things by smashing his car with a tire iron. As with every other guy Cassie confronts, we see the guy mainly react with fear and confusion at her willingness to fight back. After the guy drives off, we see a train go by in the background with a single pink train car and the word "won" on it, signaling another tally of revenge for the man she just held accountable. Following this, we see her relationship with Ryan begin to fall apart. He shows up at her house, I already mentioned, and then right after he catches her at the club leaving with Paul, one of the guys from Adam Brody's group at the beginning. The language is again all purposefully diminishing towards women. There's another crazy bitch. Paul says she's all yours to Ryan. We also find out that her reputation is starting to precede her. She's gaining notoriety as the crazy bitch, and men are starting to take notice. She invents a network of women just like her, going out at night, tricking men into picking them up only to castrate them with scissors. And just like the other men in the movie, we see primarily a fear response in Paul when he hears this, and this is perhaps the most cartoonish it gets, with him running off screen screaming like some demented Looney Tunes character. Not that it was a secret, but this does confirm to us that Cassie wants men to be afraid, that in her fantasy where this misguided plan is successful, she has men fearful of their behaviour, so she can prevent more Ninas from happening. Third on the revenge tally is Alfred Molina's character Jordan Green, who was the lawyer for Al Monroe. The film is continuing its way up the power structure, holding everyone accountable. We move from the friends who enabled the behaviour, to the dean's office who refused to investigate, and now to the lawyer who protected Al through discrediting Nina. Rather than trying to dodge accountability like all the other characters though, the lawyer has already had a nervous breakdown under the guilt of his actions and has begun the process of holding himself accountable. It's for this reason that Cassie forgives him and decides to call off what was almost certainly a hitman waiting outside. Unlike everyone else, she doesn't need to force him into accountability. The guilt over his actions has already done that for her. She knows he's now witness to the same horrors she is. Even if he helped perpetrate them in some way, he sees now what's happening, and Cassie understands that to be punishment enough, and so she forgives him. Because, as I mentioned before with cyclical violence, there has to be a way forward, a way out of it. And aside from Al Monroe, that is what Cassie wants. She wants a way out of this for everyone. The message the film is sending here is very clear. It's actually reminiscent of the ending of apartheid. For this thing to work, everyone at every level of the system has to come clean about what they've done, about the role they've played in letting these heinous acts go unpunished. Everyone needs to admit to their own guilt, their own accountability if this thing is ever going to be made right. That's exactly what we see Molina do, and so the film, or Cassie's moral code, lets him off. Because accountability is more important than revenge if we actually want to stop the continuation of cyclic violence. With that being said, the presence of the hitman at all implies that Cassie is playing a game of definites here, and that had Melina not been so forthcoming, things may have ended very differently. I think the film needed that to give Cassie back her edge, because by this point, with her revealing the Dean's daughter to never really be in danger, she's probably at her most toothless. Seeing that she was willing to go all the way to murder here does just that. Melina's role in this system is laid out in detail, and as with the Dean, we see him essentially speak to the audience directly as he explains on behalf of the film the awful practices these legal firms use to discredit victims and try to ensure the allegations never make it to court. He says some very specific things like one drunk photo at a party, and while this is broad and exemplary of many cases in the US relating to rape on college campus, it is also directly reminiscent of specific and high-profile cases like Brock Turner and Saifullah Khan and many others. It is in fact par for the course for wealthy families to pay for lawyers to immediately start trying to discredit the victim as soon as possible in the hopes that the case will never see trial. This scene is pretty straightforward, but one thing I do want to draw focus to is how the lawyer doesn't understand how intimidating he is, how on edge Cassie is as he throws himself down around her. He's really physically imposing. They've just met and he has no idea he's probably terrifying her given the context of them being alone. So while he may understand his actions in the past are wrong, and he may be holding himself accountable, he still doesn't quite understand his place. He doesn't understand how to correctly be around women. While the film presents an out for male perpetrators in the lawyer character, it doesn't seem particularly optimistic about how well they'll take to it, if Melina's flailing and crying breakdown is anything to go by. Following this encounter, we see Cassie visit Nina's mother, which I've pretty much covered already, but it's this meeting that really encourages Cassie to put away revenge momentarily and try to live a life for herself. Nina's mother isn't wrong, she's suggesting the healthy thing, but this really isn't the movie for that. We're on Cassie's mission alongside her, and just like her, we'd rather have the painful life, the Batman life, if it means seeing her revenge through. We know everyone is moving on without Nina, but we don't want that for Cass. We want the people involved to be held accountable. For the moment though, Cassie does try to go back to a happy life. We see her make up with Ryan, we get this amazing shot of her in the coffee shop, which is quite frankly iconic, and I feel as though it's an exact reference to a painting I've seen before, but I've been unable to pin it down. If anyone has the answer to that, please let me know in the comments section. I've looked everywhere and found nothing so far. It's certainly referential of haloed figures in Christian art, Mary most specifically with the blue, but I feel as though there's a more direct reference that I'm missing. What it does very purposefully with the corners though is set up a forced frame for Cassie to stand in, a frame like the one she's been alone in pretty much the whole movie. We get this image of Cassie alone in frame, and then we see Ryan come and join her as it takes on a more sort of family photo vibe. It's symbolic of her letting him into her life, of her not being entirely alone for the first time since Nina's suicide. Just as we had before, this extended break in tension is very knowing in how much it feels like a romantic comedy. Other than the conversation Cassie has with her dad after dinner, things are seemingly going very well for Cassie. And I think that conversation reminds her that this happiness, her moving on, in some way leaves Nina's memory behind, and she'd prefer the vengeance and depression over this because it would mean that Nina was still with her. Following Ryan and Cassie professing their love for one another, Madison shows up at Cassie's home and is informed by Cassie that nothing happened with the guy at the hotel. Cassie can clearly see she's had a traumatic enough time dealing with it and figures she's learned her accountability lesson. And as it turns out, she's exactly right. Madison has decided to hold herself accountable and now remembers that she actually has video of the assault on Nina. We get some more religious imagery here with the kneeling Cassie decked out in a blue dress with her hands together in almost prayer, and then we get the reveal that Ryan was at least witness to the rape of Cassie's best friend, someone who he couldn't even remember the name of, which is a pretty brutal twist, but not one that was particularly hidden given all the work the film has been doing towards getting you to hate Ryan. From here, Cassie goes to Ryan's work to confront him, reinforcing the threat she now poses to his career if he chooses not to help her. This has come up at numerous points in the movie, but I haven't pointed it out yet. Cassie replies to people many times simply with no. This is a long-standing trope in feminism, that women for the most part don't like saying no, especially not to men, and that women that do are seen as confrontational and aggressive. When the Dean tells Cassie she's crazy, Cassie simply replies with no. She could try to explain why her actions are well thought through and justified in her eyes, but she doesn't need to. She's happy telling other people no, and this is used throughout, as it is here with Ryan, as a tool to reinforce her power and her confidence. She does not forgive Ryan like she did the lawyer, even though arguably the lawyer was more active and aggressive in his misdeeds. Ryan was passive in the situation, a witness to it and an enabler of it, but not someone who directly tried to harm Nina as Al and the lawyer did. The difference between the two, why Cassie couldn't forgive Ryan, is that he refuses to accept any kind of responsibility for what happened. In fact, everything he says to her is an effort to dodge accountability, saying, "I didn't even do anything and I'm not a bad person." Ryan's inability to accept his role in events means he is now a target for Cassie's revenge. On to the fourth act of Cassie's plan, and she arrives in full stripper garb at the bachelor party. The arrangement of toxic is really threatening, and this is compounded by Joe answering the door and taking a second to check if anyone saw Cassie enter the lodge. This situation feels dangerous for Cassie, but it's also pretty obvious that she is the main threat here. I love the mud on the white stockings as she walks up to the house. We've got the idea of ruined innocence going on with the mud sullying the pureness of the white clothing, but we've also got the idea of her not caring about her appearance at all beyond the camouflage she's wearing to hunt. The red heels get slipped on and now the mud is nowhere to be seen. We know she's hurt and poisoned underneath, but her outward appearance here, the camouflage, is a perfect image of what men want. It's also a mockery, a grim joke at the expense of her dreams of being a doctor, the promising young woman at med school, now the femme fatale in the slutty nurse outfit. As soon as Cassie enters, the language is deliberately objectifying, with Al saying who ordered her, like she's more Amazon delivery than human being. Cassie, again, really for a final time here, uses her sexuality as a weapon and orders all the men to get on their knees as she performs a metaphorical oral gang rape on the crowd and has them all suck from her laced tequila bottle. We get a few really graphic close-ups, and just as we saw in the opening credits, really this is supposed to be a degradation of these guys, with them shot in a style reminiscent of how women are traditionally filmed, while Cassie takes on the traditionally masculine or phallic role. As we've seen the whole way through, she's inverting the gender power dynamic. But there is a different kind of tone to the men at the start of the film though. While there's still a silliness here, there is definitely also a tone of how threatening this is. These guys aren't so sad and pathetic. They're sexually aggressive alpha males depicted like crazed animals. We focus in on elements of arousal and aggression that demonstrates a further kind of danger to these guys than other men we've encountered in the film. I think there's almost no question that the actor who plays Al was hired because of his resemblance to Brock Turner, especially when we consider that this is supposed to be 10 years or so after the fact. I think the resemblance, not just visually, but with all the similarities between the film and the case and how high profile that case was, that this would be a pretty major coincidence if it wasn't intentional. If it isn't purposefully done, then just like the pickup artist, I think it's still very much speaking to that caricature we've built in society of the preppy rich kid turned campus rapist, and it's difficult to conjure that image without being influenced in some way by Brock's Weasley little face. It's just so ubiquitous to exactly what this film is protesting that it would be baffling if this was something the casting director was unaware of. Even down to the laughing on the video we never see, I think it's all intentionally and extremely reminiscent of the Brock Turner case. The victim in that case was Chanel Milner, who wrote a book about her experiences called Know My Name, which is extremely well written and hard hitting, and I think in every likelihood was at least some influencing source material for Fennel. Definitely worth picking up, if only to support a good cause. Moving slightly forward, we get treated to another amazing shot in the form of this bubblegum close-up. The colours in this film are amazing throughout, and I think this is where they peak for me, but she looks phenomenal this whole scene, with all the vibrant candy colours sticking out against the drab wood walls of the cabin. She heads upstairs with Al, and the degrading language continues as the group cheers them on. During this time, we get several shots of the walls of the cabin, and we can see they're filled with hunting trophies in reference to predator-prey dynamics at work here, and another classic trope of American masculinity in the collection of cowboy hats hanging on the bedroom wall. It's all visual reminders for the masculine dominance intrinsic to the American identity. As soon as we see this dominance taken away and Al is in handcuffs, we see him become immediately nervous at the situation, saying, "You're not going to do anything, are you? I love my fiancée and I don't want anything." So again, we see Cassie having this inverting effect. Not only is this guy feminized and in a position of vulnerability, like all her other targets, but now as well the rapist is afraid of getting raped. He doesn't see this as a physical threat yet, he sees it as a sexual one. And to Nina, he was that threat. Cassie has him inverted and victimized, feminized even, and that's confirmed when he describes himself as a pussy for having anxieties about it. Just like the other guys in the film, Al sees himself as a nice guy, explaining to Cass that he doesn't need to be handcuffed because he's a gentleman. And obviously this is the film's final condemnation of the nice guy persona. Here it's a definite 100% rapist and he still thinks he's a nice guy. So we've already covered that mostly, but I think it's worth looking at what exactly the film is saying here. It is distrustful of men, absolutely, but it's also distrusting of how men see themselves. Other than the lawyer, there isn't one man in this film that sees himself as a bad person, and barring Cassie's dad, every single one of them is. Really what it's pushing towards is an ignorance to their own actions. And we do see this as well in the lawyer's inability to understand how threatening he's being, and Cassie's dad in his general disconnection to Cassie's trauma. So really every male character in the movie isn't a fair judge of their own behaviour, or really even aware of how it may affect Cassie. Cassie, on the other hand, is entirely aware of what she's doing. She feels bad when seeing what her revenge has done to Madison. She forgives the lawyer even though she was angry enough to have him killed, and she's thinking clearly about it all. That's why she's certain she's not crazy. Whether it's a curse or a blessing, the film demonstrates women to be unable to escape their own empathy, and men as completely lacking it. Once Cassie has Al secured, she begins to do some top-tier mindfucking until he eventually realizes what's going on. The dialogue here is immaculate as Cassie drops in and out of the coy college girl and vengeful psychopath personas. Upon hearing the name Nina Fisher, Al immediately asked to be let go, and there's a very definite choice here to have him remember her. Ryan didn't remember her name, the dean didn't either, but Al recognizes it immediately. And I think this is done mainly for effect, mainly so we have no doubt that Al is guilty, that he knew her, but it also drives home the fact that while everyone else forgot about her, he still has intimate knowledge of her. He has some ownership over her still. As Al continues to protest, Cassie reveals that all of his friends are passed out due to her drugging them, and implies that this was a common practice of theirs at college. This just further cements the inversion of the gang rape Cassie was performing on them earlier. Now she's drugged them back like they used to do to girls at college. Cassie renders them victims, feminized by a mirroring of their own predatory process. Eventually, she makes her intentions clear with, "I want you to tell me what you did," which is maybe the most direct we've seen Cassie be in her desire for accountability. As soon as this is made explicit, Al jumps to defending himself and dodging blame, saying he didn't do anything and implying that she only regretted it afterwards, and really anything he can think of rather than own up to his own guilt. He refuses to say the R word in any form, instead just hinting at it with "you know" and a gesture with his head. As we know by now, this seals his death warrant in Cassie's mind because she needs for him to be held accountable. He can't admit to what he's done, and at first we may want to believe that he really didn't know the difference, but his mannerisms change entirely once he hears there is video of the event. He begins to beg and try to make a deal for his innocence. While he may have trouble saying it out loud, I think that's a pretty clear indicator that he knows what he did on some level. There's an extremely powerful monologue from Cassie about Nina, and there really isn't much subtext to it, but it's extremely well written, and it provides the motivation for Cassie's desire to carve Nina all over Al's body. That Nina had become stained by his name, that she was in some way now his following the attack. Carving Nina all over his body then is a way of reclaiming that ownership, of making sure Nina's name follows him wherever he goes. And that is the surface level revenge reading, but again it's more about accountability. It is not made clear that she is going to murder Al. In fact, I think all signs point to her letting him go mutilated if we really look closely. And so carving Nina's name all over his body for the rest of his life is something inescapable. It forces accountability for his actions wherever he goes. It means he can't have the perfect life he was planning to. Unfortunately for Cassie, things don't go according to plan A, and Al breaks free of his bindings and wrestles her into submission. Now this is extremely difficult to watch. I think this actor is very brave for taking the role, and he acts this violent desperation extremely well, but it definitely brings in this kind of crushing realism that hasn't been present up until now. Every guy so far has turned into a cartoon of fear and confusion when confronted by Cassie, but here we see a pretty grim reality of male violence. There's a deliberate shift between the glossy intense drunkenness and fantasy assassin stuff to this reality of a woman being murdered in a bedroom as the film comes crashing down around you. There's obviously harrowing allusions to domestic violence as well as sexual violence here, and again we see the language associated with that, like "this is your fault" as he's smothering her to death, brought into grim reality. Now Cassie did potentially try and murder this man, but I think we can all agree that there was a point where he could easily have stopped this. Yes, he had a right to defend himself, but by this point the film really doesn't want you siding with him. That's what's so smart about this dialogue. The flow always makes sense. This is her fault from his perspective, but what we hear is the trope of the violent husband or sexual predator blaming a woman for his own violent impulses. I think the most powerful thing about this is how once Cassie goes under the pillow, we do not see her again. From that point, she is just a body, a wriggling body first and then a dead body. Even when Joe checks her face, we don't see it. She is another victim. So just like we never see Nina on screen because she was gone, now Cassie is too. This is an element of reification. She has been reduced to body parts, no longer a full person. While we may see legs or a hand, we don't see Cassie as Cassie again once she goes under the the pillow. This is the film presenting the reality of attempting to violently transgress patriarchy. It doesn't end in Cassie having a happy life with Ryan, or having a life at all in fact, and it's so important to what this film is, to the realist narrative Fennell wanted to tell, that this happens. It's not a simple revenge fantasy where Cassie miniguns down a cabin full of drooling chauvinists. And the unfortunate reality for Cassie means that she can very easily be overpowered and victimized here. We get this amazing cut from night to morning as we see the shell-shocked Al laid next to the dead Cassie, who is again laid out in a sacrificial Christ or crucifix pose. This is the sacrifice she has to make for Al to finally be held accountable. There is a really bold shift to comedy here. It's obviously terrible and ghoulish that Cassie is laid there stiff, but the way the scene plays it adds a level of brevity. It's certainly one you feel bad about though, and it's that kind of guilty contrast that causes you to focus in on how uncaring these men are being about Cassie's lifeless body. It becomes an element of their bromance as they work on disposing of her, and while there's humour there, I at least found myself resisting it a little bit because I didn't want to forget Cass. I didn't want to move on, just like she didn't want to move on about Nina. And both these actors are very good at being idiotically charming, but the hate kind of overrides the humour and we still want to see them get caught. We see that all of Al's concerns in this moment are selfish. What about prison, his job, his marriage, and so on, with no concern for the fact that he's just ended a life or guilt towards his previous actions or anything of the sort. Joe doesn't question the morality of the situation either, telling Al that it flat out wasn't his fault. The delivery of "I don't know, it kind of seems like it is" right after is spot on, and honestly both these actors need commending for selling this scene because it is a tightrope between comedy and drama and they walk it perfectly. Even the way Joe bunny hops over Cassie's body so he can comfort his bro, it's still poking fun at men even in its grimmest moments. Anastasia is going to be so upset with me is probably the funniest line in the film, and it's spoken right next to the recently deceased main character. Following this, we see Ryan be given a chance at redemption when he is visited by the police investigating Cassie's disappearance. He's given an opportunity to be honest about his involvement, to accept accountability, and he chooses to preserve his own innocence rather than provide information that would help provide justice for Cassie, but also implicate his guilt. This was his last out, and his refusal to take it secures his downfall moments later. There's purposeful focus put on questioning Cassie's mental state during these scenes, in clear allusion to the social practice of worrying about a woman's mental health when she does things out of the ordinary, and more importantly, not taking practical threats seriously when crazy bitch also provides acceptable explanation to a scenario. This scene is, perhaps unintentionally, but still extremely similar to Christian Bale's exchanges with Willem Dafoe in American Psycho, the well-meaning cop sort of providing the scene a sense of creeping dread before revealing himself to be entirely unsuspicious of the character being grilled. And there's a similar meaning behind it. American Psycho, the rich aren't necessarily viewed as suspects, and here crimes against women aren't necessarily viewed as suspect to the police either. There's a similar laissez-faire attitude being employed, where the simplest answer is accepted first, and the offending characters remain beyond suspicion. As we see in short order though, Cassie has no intention on letting her vengeance go unfinished, and the tally motif is completed as police descend on Al's wedding. We see Cassie's voice returned post-mortem, and the offending parties are arrested. While Cassie may not live to see it finished, her work is completed, and the tale of the avenging young woman preying on predators in bars throughout the country can live on. It's a beautiful film, an ugly film, a phenomenally written and acted piece that wants you to be confronted with these real-world horrors. A film that wants you to be confronted by your own behavior and the ways in which we all contribute to these social issues. From things as specific as campus rape to broader, more cultural things like how we construct our language and how we treat victims. It's seriously impressive, and I hope I've been able to shed a little bit more light on everything that's going on for you. I'm so excited to see what Emerald Fennell does next because so far she's batting 1,000. That's everything for this video. Lots more stuff coming soon. Please do keep throwing video ideas at me in the comments because I'm really trying to up my frequency and what I'm putting out. Alright, catch you next time guys. Peace.